Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 10 of the regular season, in which the Sharks have lost to the Anaheim Ducks by a score of 2-1 in the shootout. So yes, the Sharks' perfect shootout record comes to an end, now 3-1 on the year in the shootouts. And so while the Sharks will claim 3 points out of a possible 4 over this weekend head-to-head with the Anaheim Ducks, on the other side of the coin, I guess, is the fact that the Ducks also managed to claim 3 of a possible 4 points, and the Sharks are, of course, in direct competition with the Ducks, along with a few other teams in the West Division, for likely the final playoff spot in that division. And this game started off about as well as you could hope. Within just the first few seconds, 11 seconds, I believe, Logan Couture gets the first goal of this game, putting the Sharks up 1-0, just as it happened in the previous game against the Ducks, but also just as it happened in the previous game against the Ducks would eventually tie it up with a goal from Lundestrom, a pretty lucky one at that, and it would be a 1-1 game in the second period. But unlike the previous game, that would be the only scoring we would see for the rest of regulation and even for the rest of the overtime. While there would be chances both ways, a couple of posts hit both ways, and many close calls, mostly for the Anaheim Ducks, I guess you could say, we would go to our shootout where, while Donato would impress as always with another beautiful move, Couture and LeBanc would both miss, and Comtois and Terry would both score for the Ducks, and as I say, the Sharks would drop it, only getting the single point. First thing to talk about would be Devan Dubnyk. Such an interesting game from Dubnyk here tonight, because just on the scoreboard, you should be able to say that Dubnyk played a very, very solid game and made a few massive saves for the San Jose Sharks to keep them alive. I mean, the biggest one, I guess you could say, was in the last few seconds of the overtime. Just poor coverage breakdown, especially by Timo Meier on this play, and Dubnyk comes up with a huge save just to give the Sharks a chance in the shootout. But then it was also kind of a polar opposite game from what we saw from Jones last night, where Jones was mediocre in regulation but was lights out in the shootout. Dubnyk here was lights out in regulation but quite mediocre in the shootout. He bites very, very hard on Troy Terry's first attempt. He ends up getting a puck right through the wickets on Comtois' attempt, and while he makes a save on Shattenkirk, it does not end up being enough. So a bit of a weak shootout from Devan Dubnyk, so it ends up costing the Sharks a point, I guess, but Devan Dubnyk is also likely the only reason why the Sharks even earned a single point in the first place. Next, we'll be talking about Rudolf Balcers as he draws into the lineup for the first time here this season. He takes Chmelevsky's place in that regard, and while Balcers ended up almost doubling the ice time of what Chmelevsky had yesterday, he didn't really have as much of an impact. Balcers was almost invisible here tonight, really sort of just kind of gliding around, not necessarily from a lack of effort, but just for a lack of really anything offensively forming. I mean, I guess he wasn't a massive liability necessarily, but still there just wasn't really much going on with Balcers. I would doubt he manages to hold this spot in the lineup, and it'll be interesting to see who actually gets this spot come Tuesday against the Kings. Next, I'll be talking about the San Jose Sharks defensive pairs. So besides the third pair that has been at flux at times this season, the other two pairings have been rather stable, with maybe a couple of swaps here or there, Ferraro occasionally going from playing with Karlsson to playing with Burns. But we finally had a massive shakeup here, Burns going with Ferraro, and the second pairing, Karlsson with Shemek, which is a pairing that we very rarely see, and then Vlasic ending up on the third pairing with Nizov. And this was very interesting to see, and you could see it reflected in the ice time. Burns still leading the way on defense, but Ferraro rather close behind them, just about a minute, and then Karlsson was actually third on the team in terms of ice time. Now, it should be noted that the Sharks only had a single power play this game, which usually the Sharks will get more power plays, which will inflate Karlsson's ice time, and that's why usually him and Burns are top two, and so it doesn't necessarily mean so much that Ferraro still has more ice time, but the fact that, he was a rookie last season, and he was maybe a third pairing defenseman at times, second pairing last season, and now all of a sudden he's getting 25 plus minutes a night, has been a massive step forward, and likely the best thing to come out of these early parts of the Sharks season thus far. Another good thing to see is Shemek really making some progress here. Of course, he did not play the first couple of games of this season. He's still dealing with the lingering knee issues, and then even when he drew back into lineup, only getting around 10-11 minutes a night there on the third pairing. But he's finally sort of getting more ice time, which should hopefully mean that things are getting better for him. He hit about 17 minutes of ice time here tonight, which is, I guess, pretty good playing on the pairing with Karlsson. And then when you take a look at Marc-Edouard Vlasic, in terms of 5-on-5 ice time, he actually was the least played defenseman on the Sharks this game. In terms of total ice time, he was still above Knyzhov, but still at 5-on-5 being behind Knyzhov is definitely somewhat indicative of what Booner has been thinking about Vlasic's game thus far this season. And you don't even have the power play excuse that I made with Karlsson for Vlasic, because he'd never really get power play time anyway. And so it's really interesting to see this diminishing ice time for Vlasic in this regard, only getting about 15 to 16 minutes, and he has never seen these low minutes since probably the beginning of his career in the first couple of years with the San Jose Sharks, about 15 years ago or so at this point. And just a small comment to make on to Knyzhov. He was a defenseman who I thought looked pretty good. He looked okay as a sixth defenseman through the first couple of games of this season, but it feels as though quite quickly he's actually come rather quickly into his own, in my opinion. And not only has his defensive game gotten slightly better, but also he has gotten a lot more confident offensively. So it's actually seeming as though the Sharks do have a pretty solid top six in terms of defense at this point. Now, this does not mean that they've been playing good defensive hockey, but what I mean is that as long as there are no injuries, I suspect we will be seeing these six defensemen play night in and night out for the rest of this season, unless something drastic happens with Knyzhov's game if it falls off of a cliff. And finally, the last player to talk about would be Timo Meier. Now, Meier has been a bit of a question mark thus far this season. Coming into the year, it seems as though the Sharks had four really solid top six players to play with: Couture, Kane, Hertl, and Meier. And while Hertl, Couture, and Kane have all maintained their spot in the top six throughout the first 10 games of this season, Meier has been the only of these top four forwards who has been experimented with on the third line. And this isn't because the Sharks are necessarily looking to spread their offense through their top nine, although that is obviously a reason, but it's mostly because Meier has been quite disappointing thus far this season, and it was a very, very up and down game here tonight. While there were a couple of good chances, one actually ends up hitting the crossbar, which was a chance that the Sharks to take a 2-1 lead in a pretty important moment. Meier also had many defensive errors and was still looking pretty lost in the offensive zone at times as well. Obviously, the big one that comes to mind is in the last few seconds of the overtime, where he just completely loses coverage of, I believe, Rickard Rakell, which allowed Rickard Rakell to have a wide open net tap in, which he ends up sort of shooting right into Devan Dubnyk. But it has been a struggle for Timo Meier thus far this season, and we were sort of hoping that the 1920 year was just a bit of a down year for him, and just in general as a team, the San Jose Sharks, and that Meier would be able to return to his 18-19 form this season, but it hasn't really yet happened. And even though Meier was put right back onto the second line with Hertl and Marleau for this game, while there was a slight improvement, it's not nearly enough to really that we should be proud of what Timo Meier has been doing. He needs to be a lot better. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday. They'll face off against the Los Angeles Kings for the first time this season, and they'll look to try and get their first actual sweep of one of these head-to-head mini-series, as they've gone 0-2 at worst, like they did against the Avalanche, and in every other little mini-series, they've gone 1-1. Can they get the 2-0 against the Kings? I guess we'll see. Class dismissed.